Welcome to Ask Prep, your trusted companion for UPSC and IAS preparation. Today, we delve into a crucial and pressing topic in ethics and society, which is human rights violations. Human rights are the fundamental freedoms and entitlements inherent to all individuals, regardless of race, gender, nationality, or religion. These rights encompass civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and environmental dimensions, aiming to ensure dignity, equality, and justice for all. For UPSC aspirants, understanding human rights violations is vital, as it is a recurring theme in topics like governance, international relations, social justice, and ethics. Despite global efforts to uphold human rights, violations persist due to war, systemic inequalities, authoritarian regimes, and socio-economic disparities, leaving vulnerable groups, such as women, children, refugees, and minorities, particularly affected. Through this session, we'll explore the types of human rights violations, their causes, real-world examples, and actionable solutions to address these challenges. By developing a comprehensive understanding of this topic, you'll gain insights into how protecting human rights is key to fostering global peace, social equity, and sustainable development. Without further delay, let's get started. Introduction: Human rights violations refer to the infringement of the basic rights and freedoms guaranteed to every individual by international law. These violations can occur at various levels, whether by governments, organizations, or individuals, and can manifest in different forms such as physical abuse, discrimination, denial of rights, and exploitation. Human rights violations undermine the dignity, equality, and freedom of individuals, often resulting in severe social, political, and economic consequences. Globally, efforts to combat human rights violations have been a central focus for organizations like the United Nations and various non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Despite these efforts, human rights violations remain a significant challenge in many parts of the world, exacerbated by conflict, social inequalities, and political repression. Understanding the causes, impact, and frameworks to address these violations is essential for fostering a world that upholds the inherent rights and freedoms of all individuals. Types of human rights violations: civil and political rights violations. Civil and political rights form the foundation of individual freedom and political participation. Violations in this category include torture and inhumane treatment. This refers to physical or mental abuse inflicted upon individuals, often during detentions or under oppressive regimes. Torture can be used to extract confessions, intimidate political opponents, or suppress dissent. Arbitrary arrests and detention. This occurs when individuals are detained without due process or clear legal justification. It is a significant violation of the right to personal liberty and fair trial, commonly seen in regimes with authoritarian rule. Censorship and suppression of political opposition. In some countries, governments restrict free speech, silence critical media outlets, and suppress political opposition. These actions limit freedom of expression, deny citizens the ability to participate in political discourse, and undermine democracy. Election manipulation and voter suppression. Violations include preventing people from voting freely, intimidating voters, and rigging elections. This deprives citizens of their political rights and undermines the democratic process. Example: in authoritarian regimes like North Korea or Belarus, the suppression of political opposition, torture, and arbitrary arrests are common forms of civil and political rights violations. Economic, social, and cultural rights violations. These rights focus on individuals' ability to achieve well-being and economic stability through access to basic resources, education, healthcare, and social participation. Violations include denial of education. In many regions, especially in conflict zones or areas with systemic poverty, children, especially girls, are denied access to education. Lack of education perpetuates cycles of poverty and limits opportunities for economic mobility. Denial of health services. Violations include government failure to provide essential healthcare services, such as medical treatments, vaccinations, and maternal care, especially in underdeveloped areas. Poor working conditions and exploitation. Workers in industries like textiles, mining, and agriculture may face hazardous conditions, child labor, discrimination, and exploitation in the workplace. This violates their right to work in humane conditions and receive fair wages. Unequal access to resources. Discriminatory practices often limit marginalized communities' access to housing, clean water, sanitation, and social services. This deepens inequality and exacerbates social divides. Example: the lack of access to education for girls in rural areas of Afghanistan or the widespread exploitation of migrant workers in the Middle East are examples of economic, social, and cultural rights violations. Environmental rights violations. Environmental rights violations occur when environmental degradation directly affects individuals' ability to access clean air, water, and land, impacting their overall health and well-being. These violations include pollution and environmental degradation. When industries or governments fail to regulate or mitigate pollution, people living in affected areas suffer from diseases, displacement, and loss of livelihoods. This disproportionately impacts vulnerable communities such as low-income populations and indigenous people. Deforestation and loss of biodiversity. Deforestation and destruction of ecosystems violate the right of communities, particularly indigenous groups, to maintain their cultural, spiritual, and economic ties to their land. Climate change and displacement. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and other climate impacts displace communities, particularly in coastal or low-lying regions. Climate-induced displacement is a growing human rights issue. Example: the environmental degradation caused by industrial activities in the Niger Delta, Nigeria, has led to loss of livelihood, severe health issues, and displacement of local communities. Similarly, climate change-induced displacement in the Pacific Islands is an emerging environmental rights issue. Collective rights violations. Collective rights violations are concerned with the rights of groups, particularly marginalized or vulnerable communities. These rights include rights of indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples' rights to land, culture, and self-determination are often violated through land dispossession, forced relocation, and lack of legal recognition. Refugees and displaced populations. Refugees and displaced persons face violations of their rights to safety, dignity, and adequate living conditions. This includes inadequate access to housing, education, food, healthcare, and legal protection. Religious and ethnic minorities. Religious and ethnic groups often face persecution, discrimination, or violence because of their beliefs or identity. This can include hate crimes, forced assimilation, or genocide. Example: the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and the mistreatment of indigenous peoples in the Amazon are stark examples of collective rights violations. Causes of human rights violations. Governmental oppression. Authoritarian regimes or governments may infringe upon the basic freedoms of their citizens to maintain power. Corruption. Corrupt practices hinder access to justice and perpetuate rights violations. Social inequality. Discrimination based on caste, race, gender, or religion contributes to marginalization and systemic violations. Conflict and war. Armed conflicts often lead to widespread violations of human rights, including genocide, forced displacement, and sexual violence. Corporate exploitation. Multinational companies sometimes violate human rights by exploiting workers or causing environmental harm. Consequences of human rights violations: loss of freedom, denial of civil liberties, and freedom of expression. Social and economic injustice. Marginalized communities suffer from unequal access to healthcare, education, and employment. Psychological harm. Victims may face long-lasting trauma, including depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Destabilization. Widespread violations can undermine social stability, peace, and democracy. Global condemnation. Violating human rights invites international criticism, sanctions, or intervention. Notable examples of human rights violations: India's caste discrimination, systemic violence and discrimination against Dalits, often leading to social exclusion and exploitation. Rohingya crisis. Ethnic violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar, resulting in displacement, violence, and deaths. Role of national and international bodies. National Human Rights Commissions, NHRC monitor human rights violations and recommend actions. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs play an advocacy and watchdog role, bringing violations to light and providing support to victims. The United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC, coordinates international efforts to prevent and respond to human rights violations. Conclusion: addressing human rights violations requires a multifaceted approach that includes legal reforms, active civil society involvement, global cooperation, and political will. By prioritizing human rights, societies can create a more just, peaceful, and equitable world. At AskPrep, we aim to bring such insights to help you prepare better for your UPSC and IAS examinations. Thank you. This is AskPrep, Ask Us Anything, your guide to mastering UPSC and IAS preparation. Let's decode complex topics and simplify your journey to success.